The rain hammered against the cracked asphalt of Murphy's gas station like nature's own percussion, each drop catching the sickly neon glow that flickered against the October darkness. It was nearly midnight on the outskirts of Cincinnati, where the city's promises faded into empty lots and broken streetlights. Michael Carter pulled his beaten Ford pickup under the canopy, windshield wipers squeaking their final protest before falling silent. As he stepped out, collar turned up against the cold. Something made him pause. There, beside a gleaming black Mercedes that looked as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine, sat a young woman. She was hunched over, arms wrapped protectively around what was unmistakably a pregnant belly, tears streaming down her face like the rain above. The question that would haunt him for weeks formed in his mind. Who was this girl, and why was someone who clearly had everything crying alone at a forgotten gas station? Michael Carter lived in the shadows between two worlds, and tonight both were colliding in ways he never anticipated. For 6 months, he'd been Detective Marcus Thompson to the criminal underworld, a corrupt cop willing to launder money through a network of shell companies. But his real identity was Special Agent Michael Carter, and every conversation, every transaction, every handshake was being recorded to build the biggest racketeering case the FBI had seen in decades. The operation was so deep, so carefully constructed, that even his 8-year-old son Ethan believed his father was just another single dad struggling to make ends meet after losing his wife to cancer. Tonight's meeting had been different. Viktor Kozlov, the Russian money man behind a $300 million operation, had been spooked. Someone was asking questions, digging into records that should have stayed buried. The network was preparing to eliminate loose ends, and Michael suspected he might be one of them. His cover was solid. But in this business, paranoia was a survival skill, and Victor's paranoia was legendary. As Michael pumped gas into his truck, his trained eyes swept the empty station. No surveillance he could detect, no cars that had followed him from the warehouse meeting. But something felt wrong. A prickle between his shoulder blades that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan and 5 years of undercover work. Then he saw her again, and every instinct screamed that she was connected to whatever danger was stalking him. Rebecca Sterling had been running for 18 hours straight, and she was finally understanding what real fear felt like. Not the carefully managed anxiety of board meetings or hostile takeovers, but the bone-deep terror that came from knowing people wanted you dead and having nowhere left to hide. The baby kicked restlessly against her ribs, as if sensing its mother's panic, and Rebecca pressed both hands to her belly in a futile attempt at comfort. She thought being disinherited was the worst thing that could happen. Her stepmother, Victoria's ultimatum, had been delivered with characteristic coldness: terminate the pregnancy and return to the family, or lose everything and disappear forever. Rebecca had chosen her child over her fortune, expecting exile but not execution. That was before she'd discovered what the Sterling family fortune was really built on, before she'd seen the offshore accounts and phantom corporations, before she'd understood why her unexpected pregnancy had made her such a liability. The Sterling name wasn't just about real estate and shipping. It was the legitimate face of an international money laundering empire that cleaned cash for everyone from drug cartels to terrorist organizations. Her father had tried to go straight in his final years, but some stains never washed clean, and some partnerships couldn't be dissolved with lawyers and paperwork. When Rebecca had started asking questions about her inheritance, about the family's charitable foundations and overseas investments, she'd unknowingly triggered alarms that reached all the way to Moscow. Now Viktor Kozlov's people were hunting her, and they had orders to make sure she disappeared permanently, along with the baby that could someday inherit not just money, but knowledge that could destroy dozens of powerful people across 3 continents. The pregnant woman looked up as Michael approached, and he saw intelligence in her eyes, along with the fear. This wasn't some strung-out addict or domestic violence victim. This was someone educated, someone who'd lived with privilege until very recently. But privilege was a poor shield against the kind of people who solved problems with bullets. "Miss, are you all right?" Michael kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. Years of undercover work had taught him to read people quickly, and this woman was balanced on a knife's edge between flight and collapse. "I'm fine," Rebecca lied, the words automatic. She'd been taught from childhood that Sterlings didn't show weakness to strangers, didn't air family problems in public, didn't ask for help from people beneath their social station. But looking at this man's weathered face, kind eyes, clothes that spoke of honest work, she felt something crack inside her chest. "Car trouble?" Michael nodded toward the Mercedes, though he could see the engine was purring quietly. His cop instincts were screaming that something was seriously wrong here. Expensive car, designer clothes, but she was sitting on the ground like she had nowhere to go. Either she was running from someone, or she was bait in a trap he couldn't see yet. Not car trouble, Rebecca whispered. Life trouble. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the conversation urgent. Michael found himself making a decision that violated every protocol he'd been taught about maintaining cover and avoiding civilian entanglements. But looking at this pregnant woman shivering in the October cold, he couldn't walk away. There's a diner about 5 miles down the road, he said. 24 hours. Good coffee. And booth seats that are a lot more comfortable than wet pavement. What do you say? Rebecca studied his face, searching for the calculating expression she'd learned to recognize in men who wanted something from the Sterling family. Instead, she saw genuine concern, and something else, a watchfulness that suggested he understood danger better than most people. Against every instinct her privileged upbringing had given her. She nodded. The Moonlight Diner was exactly what its name promised, a slice of Americana that had survived since the 1950s, complete with black and white checkered floors and red vinyl booths, that had seen everything from first dates to business deals to heartbreak confessions. At this hour, the only other customers were a trucker reading a paperback novel and a waitress named Betty, who looked like she'd been pouring coffee since the Eisenhower administration. Michael chose a booth in the back corner, positioning himself to watch both entrances while keeping his back to the wall. Old habits died hard, and tonight, his paranoia felt justified. Rebecca slid across from him, finally allowing herself to relax slightly for the first time in days. When's the baby due? Michael asked, gesturing toward her obvious pregnancy. February, Rebecca said, then found herself adding, February 14th. Valentine's Day baby. The irony wasn't lost on her, a child conceived in love, carried through betrayal, and destined to be born into whatever mess she could create from the ruins of her former life. First one, Rebecca nodded, then surprised herself by asking, Do you have children? A son. 8 years old. Michael's expression softened in a way that made Rebecca's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Lost his mother 3 years ago. Cancer. It's been just the two of us since then. The conversation that followed broke every rule Rebecca had ever learned about talking to strangers. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was hormones. Maybe it was the simple human need to connect with someone who wasn't trying to control or eliminate her. She found herself talking about the loneliness of pregnancy without a partner, about the terror of facing motherhood alone, about the way everyone in her life had suddenly become strangers when she'd chosen her baby over their expectations. She was careful not to mention names or specifics, but she painted a picture of family betrayal that made Michael's jaw clench with protective anger. He'd seen enough domestic situations to recognize the signs of someone fleeing abuse. But this felt different, bigger, and more dangerous than a controlling boyfriend or disapproving parents. What kind of work do you do? Rebecca asked eventually, studying his face in the diner's warm light. There were small scars she hadn't noticed before, calluses on his hands that spoke of physical work, but also an alertness in his posture that suggested someone accustomed to danger. Security, Michael said, which was technically true. I make sure people stay safe, protect things that need protecting. He paused, then added with careful casualness, What about you? Before all this life trouble started, Rebecca almost smiled. I was supposed to take over the family business. Import, export, international shipping, that sort of thing. Turns out, I wasn't quite ready for the family business. That was when Michael's blood turned to ice water. Import, export, international shipping. In his 6 months undercover, he'd learned that those were euphemisms used by exactly one organization in this part of Ohio, the network he'd been infiltrating. Viktor Kozlov's operation moved money through shipping companies, used import-export businesses to justify cash transfers, employed dozens of legitimate-looking corporations to clean hundreds of millions in dirty money. The pregnant woman sitting across from him wasn't just some runaway heiress. She was connected to the very people who'd been discussing loose ends and cleanup operations at tonight's meeting. The question was whether she was a victim or a part of the trap that was tightening around him. Michael's phone buzzed with a text message, and his blood froze as he read it. Thompson, your cover is blown. Extract immediately. Do not return to safe house. They know everything. The message was from Agent Sarah Chen, his handler, and it meant that 6 months of careful work had just turned into a sprint for survival. Viktor Kozlov's paranoia had finally identified the federal agent in his organization, and if Michael's cover was blown, then everyone connected to him was in immediate danger, including the pregnant woman who just admitted her family was in the import-export business. "We need to leave," Michael said quietly, his demeanor shifting from concerned stranger to protective operator in the space of a heartbeat. Right now, Rebecca saw the change immediately, the way his body language became predatory, alert, dangerous. "What's wrong?" "The kind of people who make problems disappear permanently. Just figured out where I am." Michael was already dropping money on the table, his eyes scanning the parking lot through the diner's windows. "And if you're connected to the Sterling shipping fortune, then they're probably looking for you too." The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She'd been so careful not to mention specifics, but apparently she hadn't been careful enough. "How do you know about—" "Because I've been investigating your family's business partners for 6 months, Michael said grimly. "And tonight, I found out that everyone involved in that investigation is being eliminated." The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Rebecca wasn't just a pregnant heiress on the run. She was a walking witness to financial crimes that could bring down an international conspiracy. And Michael wasn't just a helpful stranger, he was a federal agent whose blown cover had just put them both in the crosshairs of people who killed for a living. Through the diner's window, Michael spotted them, first black SUVs moving too slowly, too purposefully through the empty streets. Professional surveillance vehicles, with the kind of modifications that spoke of serious money and serious violence. Victor's cleanup crew had found them. "Back exit," Michael said, grabbing Rebecca's hand. Now, they moved through the diner's kitchen, past a startled cook who was too smart to ask questions, and out into an alley that smelled of grease and garbage. Michael's truck was parked on the street, but the SUVs had already positioned themselves to cut off escape routes. They were trapped, and the professionals hunting them were closing in with military precision. "My car," Rebecca whispered, pointing toward the Mercedes that was parked 2 blocks away. "It's faster than your truck." "It's also been compromised," Michael replied, remembering the way she'd been sitting beside it at the gas station. "They've had time to plant tracking devices, maybe explosives. We're walking into a kill box if we go back there." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the alley, followed by the distinctive metallic click of weapons being readied. Victor's men were professionals, former military, experienced killers who'd eliminated problems across 3 continents. They wouldn't make the mistakes that got them caught, and they wouldn't leave witnesses who could testify later. Michael made a decision that would haunt him for months afterward. He pulled out his service weapon, a Glock, that he'd never had to fire in anger during his entire undercover assignment, and prepared to turn a covert investigation into an open war. "Stay behind me," he told Rebecca. "Whatever happens, protect the baby." The firefight that erupted in the alley behind the Moonlight Diner lasted less than 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Michael had the advantage of position and training, but Victor's men had superior numbers and equipment that included body armor and automatic weapons. Bullets sparked off dumpsters and shattered windows, while Rebecca pressed herself against a brick wall, both hands covering her belly, trying to shield her unborn child from a war zone. Michael moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned urban combat in places where mistakes meant death. He put down 2 attackers with carefully aimed shots, used a delivery truck for cover while reloading, and managed to wound a 3rd before a lucky shot from across the street caught him in the shoulder and spun him around. That was when Rebecca Sterling discovered that privilege and private schools had never prepared her for real courage, but somehow she found it anyway. As Michael stumbled and fought to stay conscious, she grabbed his weapon and provided covering fire, while he dragged himself toward the street where his truck waited. Neither of them would ever be able to explain exactly how they escaped that alley alive. Luck played a part, as did Michael's training and Rebecca's unexpected competence under fire. But mostly it was the desperate determination of 2 people who'd found something worth protecting in each other and weren't willing to let it die in a Cincinnati back alley. They drove through the night with Michael fighting blood loss and Rebecca navigating by instinct through back roads that avoided major highways and traffic cameras. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or arteries, but Michael was weakening by the hour, and Rebecca was 6 months pregnant and operating on pure adrenaline. "There's a safe house," Michael managed to say, as Rebecca drove his truck through the October darkness. "Federal facility, about 2 hours north." "If we can get there, what then?" Rebecca asked, though she was already following his directions toward the interstate. If your cover is blown, if my family is connected to these people, what happens to us? Michael looked at her profile in the dashboard light, this woman who'd gone from crying alone at a gas station to saving his life in a firefight, all in the space of 6 hours. She was asking about their future together, and the assumption that they had one filled him with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Then we figure out how to build a life that's real, instead of another cover story, he said quietly. The safe house turned out to be a farmhouse that looked abandoned from the outside, but was equipped with enough surveillance equipment and communication gear to run a small war. Agent Sarah Chen was waiting for them with a medical kit and the kind of grim expression that suggested their problems were just beginning. Victor's people hit 3 federal facilities tonight, she reported while treating Michael's shoulder wound. They're cleaning house across the entire operation. Witnesses, agents, informants, anyone who could testify is being eliminated. What about Rebecca? Michael asked. She's not part of the investigation. She's just caught in the middle. Chen looked at the pregnant woman who was sitting quietly in the corner, both hands protecting her belly while processing everything she'd learned in the past few hours. She's not just caught in the middle anymore. She's the key to everything. The explanation that followed revealed the true scope of what they were fighting. The Sterling family fortune wasn't just connected to Victor's money laundering network. It was the foundation that the entire operation was built on. Rebecca's grandfather had made a deal with the devil decades ago, allowing his shipping empire to be used for moving more than legitimate cargo. The partnership had made the family incredibly wealthy, but it had also made them incredibly dangerous to cross. When Rebecca's father had tried to go legitimate before his death, he'd put together a detailed record of every transaction, every partnership, every crime that had built the Sterling fortune. Those records were hidden somewhere, that only Rebecca could access a safety measure designed to protect the family from their criminal partners, but also a death sentence for anyone who tried to use them. Victor's people don't just want you dead, Chen explained to Rebecca. They want those records destroyed, and they want to make sure no one else can access them. Your baby represents the next generation of potential problems for them. Rebecca placed both hands on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had become her constant reminder that she was carrying more than just a child. She was carrying the future. So what do we do? Michael looked at this woman who'd come into his life through pure chance and changed everything about who he thought he was. She was asking him to help her fight a war against some of the most dangerous people in the world, to protect not just her life but their child's future, to choose love over safety and truth over survival. We go get those records, he said simply. And then we make sure Viktor Kozlov never threatens another family. The Sterling estate looked like a fortress in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by walls that had been built to keep secrets in rather than intruders out. Michael and Rebecca approached through woods that bordered the property, moving carefully through terrain that Rebecca had played in as a child, but which now felt alien and dangerous. The records are in my father's study, Rebecca whispered as they reached the outer wall, hidden behind a painting that only responds to my voice and fingerprint. He designed it that way because he knew someday the family might need insurance against their partners. Getting inside required skills that Michael had learned in military special operations. Lockpicking, alarm bypassing, movement through hostile territory where discovery meant death. But it also required Rebecca's intimate knowledge of the house's layout, the security system's blind spots, and the hiding places that 3 generations of Sterlings had used to keep their secrets safe. They made it to the study without triggering any alarms, but as Rebecca activated the hidden safe behind her father's portrait, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching through the estate's main gate. Victor's cleanup crew had anticipated this move, and they'd come prepared for a siege. The records that Rebecca retrieved told a story of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, business, and law enforcement. Names, dates, bank account numbers, photographs of meetings that should never have taken place. Everything needed to bring down, not just Victor's operation, but dozens of other criminal enterprises that had used Sterling shipping as their foundation. This could change everything, Michael said, scanning through files that represented years of patient evidence gathering. Your father was building a case that could have brought down half the organized crime families on the East Coast. That's why they killed him, Rebecca said quietly. The official cause was a heart attack, but I always wondered. He'd been acting strange in his final months, secretive, like he was preparing for war. The sound of breaking glass from the first floor told them that Victor's men had decided subtlety was no longer necessary. They were in the house, moving with professional efficiency toward the study where their targets were trapped with evidence that could destroy them all. Michael had 6 rounds left in his pistol and no backup weapon. Rebecca was 6 months pregnant and emotionally exhausted from discovering that her entire life had been built on blood money. The men hunting them were professionals with unlimited resources and orders to leave no witnesses alive. But they also had something Victor's people didn't understand: they had each other, and they had a future worth fighting for that went beyond money or power or survival. As the footsteps grew closer, Michael and Rebecca made their final stand in a room full of books and secrets, fighting not just for their lives, but for the right to build something honest from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. The battle for the Sterling estate lasted until sunrise, when federal agents responding to Michael's emergency beacon finally arrived to find a house full of bodies and 2 survivors who'd somehow managed to turn a massacre into a victory. Viktor Kozlov's cleanup crew had come to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence, but they'd underestimated the determination of a pregnant woman fighting for her child's future, and a federal agent who'd found something worth dying for. In the aftermath, as paramedics treated their wounds and investigators cataloged evidence that would fuel prosecutions for decades, Michael and Rebecca sat together on the estate's front steps, watching the sun rise over the remains of the Sterling Empire. The fortune was gone, seized by federal authorities as proceeds of criminal activity. But somehow that felt like freedom rather than loss. "So what happens now?" Rebecca asked, her hand resting on a belly that had survived gunfights and explosions, and the collapse of everything she'd thought she knew about her family. Michael looked at this woman who'd gone from helpless victim to fierce protector in the space of a single night, who'd saved his life as often as he'd saved hers, who'd chosen truth over comfort and courage over safety at every critical moment. "Now," he said, taking her hand as emergency vehicles filled the estate's circular driveway, "we go home and figure out how to raise a family that's built on something better than secrets and lies." The house they eventually bought was nothing like the Sterling estate, a modest farmhouse on 20 acres outside Nashville, far from the corruption of big cities and old money. Michael returned to regular law enforcement work, using his experience to train other undercover agents while staying close enough to home to be the kind of father that Ethan deserved and the kind of husband that Rebecca had never dared to hope for. Rebecca discovered that losing a fortune was less important than gaining a family. The baby that had started as an unplanned pregnancy became the center of a life built on honesty rather than appearances, on love rather than legacy, on the simple truth that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. David Michael Carter was born on February 14th, just as Rebecca had predicted, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces, and arriving with the kind of stubborn determination that suggested he'd inherited the best qualities from both parents. Michael held his son for the first time in the same hospital where he'd brought Rebecca for prenatal care, feeling the same overwhelming mixture of terror and protective love that had driven him to risk everything for a pregnant stranger at a gas station. As they drove home from the hospital, Rebecca, Michael, baby David, and 8-year-old Ethan, who'd appointed himself chief protector of his new brother, they passed Murphy's gas station, where their story had begun. The neon sign was still flickering, the pavement was still cracked, and it still looked like the kind of place where nothing important ever happened. But sometimes, the most important stories begin in the most unlikely places, with the most unlikely people, in moments when the whole world seems to be falling apart. Sometimes love grows from lies, families form from fragments, and the future emerges from the ashes of everything that came before. Rebecca Sterling Carter had learned that her real inheritance wasn't money or property or social standing. It was the courage to choose what mattered most when everything else was stripped away. And Michael Carter had discovered that the most important undercover operation of his life was the one where he finally became the man he'd always wanted to be: a husband, a father, and a protector of the things that truly couldn't be replaced.